This is a Walthers Amtrak F40, and it's one of my latest acquisitions. I'll begin with the good. One thing I do really like about this unit is the DCC and sound. This locomotive, as I just mentioned, came from the factory with DCC and sound. This system is really good, and I think it sounds great. The horn is really crisp, the prime mover sounds good. My only real complaint is that the bell is a little bit quiet, but that's pretty easy to fix with a bit of basic programming. The performance of this locomotive is also pretty good. I've only really tested this thing with 5 or so cars, and it did that perfectly fine. I don't really have a need for this unit to pull more than 6 cars at any point in time, so its performance is perfectly fine, and I feel like it has the ability to pull a much longer train if I desired to. It also runs relatively quietly, at least in terms of motor noise. I've got a lot of engines that are rather loud, and this one, if you have all the sound and everything off, is basically silent, which is great, meaning that there's no motor noise, no drivetrain noise, none of that over the sound, and it's just a nice quiet locomotive to run if you wanted to run it without the sound. There are a few things I don't really like about this locomotive, and that is mainly relating to the details of it. For the price tag and the age of this locomotive, which is pretty new, it's really basic. For example, the fans up here, they're just basic plastic. So many other manufacturers have at least see-through fans, even Bachmann does that, which this locomotive does not happen to have. The handrails back here are also kind of chunky, and they're just made out of plastic, which does not seem like it'll hold up the best if you're not very careful with this thing. And also, it's a little bit more difficult to see, but you can actually see the wires for the lighting and whatnot through the cab of the locomotive. It's not a huge deal, but it is something kind of annoying that they could have tucked away a little bit better. I might fix this in the future, but for now, it'll just bother me. Another minor issue with the details is that the proportions of this thing are way off, as in this locomotive is quite a bit shorter than it should be. A regular F40, which I have googled, is about 56 feet long, and based on my ruler here, which gives a pretty accurate 1/87th scale by the foot ruler, it is only a scale 54 feet long, which is about 2 feet shorter than it should be. It's a little bit difficult to notice, but once you notice it, it's hard to unsee it, especially if you see a lot of F40s around. Out of the box, this locomotive had 2 minor issues, both of which I've resolved. The first is the coupler height. I like having all my fleet upgraded to the NMRA standard, and I basically recognize that whenever I get a new piece of equipment, I'll have to mess with the coupler height. I had to replace the Cadies on both ends with a slightly higher style, and now they match the rest of my fleet and the standards perfectly. Of note though, the coupler heights on this thing match the stock coupler heights of my Horizon fleet. So out of the box, this thing would work perfectly fine with those cars. It just annoyed me, so I fixed it. The other thing, which was actually a problem, was the plow. Out of the box, this plow was way too low, and it was actually hitting on a whole bunch of the connections in the rails at the club, and that is a pretty major problem. So what I've done is I just kind of sanded down the top here so it's angled back slightly, and I've sanded down with a file the bottom here. It's not the perfect solution, but it has solved the issue. It's not the prettiest, but I can paint over it in the future. Plus, it's on the underside of the locomotive and behind the plow, so you're basically never going to see this unless you pick up the locomotive. Despite those 2 problems and the inaccuracies with the detail, I do really like this locomotive. It does exactly what I need it to do, and I do like the concept that I have for it. I might upgrade to a Rapido model way out in the future, but for now, I think this engine will be perfectly fine to serve its spot in my fleet. With my thoughts of this locomotive out of the way, let's go run this thing.